The following is a project of our nonprofit newsroom. Support Midcoast Morning and local community-centered journalism today by signing up to be a monthly sustaining donor at chly.ca/donate. It doesn't take much money to support local news.
Hello and welcome to Midcoast Morning. I'm Joe Pugh. The dollar is in the details in Nanaimo's 2023 annual municipal report. Adopted at a council meeting this week, the 122-page document breaks down last year's finances. On today's show, we're going to cover where the city got money, where it spent money, how debt works at the municipal level, what the city's surplus is, what that actually means, and more. To help do that, I got in touch with Nanaimo's Director of Finance.
I'm Wendy Fulla, and I'm the Director of Finance for the City of Nanaimo.
Well, thank you very much for making some time to speak with me today. We're going to be talking about the City of Nanaimo's finances, and I want to start maybe by breaking down the big ledger line items. Last year, 2023, we had a surplus of more than $72 million. Can you help put that number in context?
I think something to keep in mind is when we talk about surplus there is not the same as when people think of a business and they had an operating profit. Our surplus is much more complicated in a municipality to explain. I think it's better to instead focus on, we had a operational surplus, which each March we go to council and we allocate the operating surplus in our general sewer and water funds. Generally, those funds are allocated to reserves for future projects or initiatives. And then the other thing to focus on is the city's accumulated surplus, which is our investment in net tangible capital assets, as well as our operating and statutory reserves. So I think those are kind of better things to focus on than just looking at the surplus number on the financial statements, because it's much more complicated to explain to the general public.
So you talked about our total accumulated surplus there. Maybe let's shift our focus to that. So our total accumulated surplus, it exceeds $1 billion. Now, most of that, $814 million, is capital assets. And then if I understand correctly, we've got around $194 million in various reserve funds. Can you help provide a little bit more detail about how that all works?
Sure. So investments in tangible capital assets make up the majority of the city's accumulated surplus balance, as you said. This represents the net book value of our diverse infrastructure. So this is our lands, our buildings, our roads, our underground utilities, our sewer mains, our water mains, those sorts of things. The rest is made up of operating reserves, as you said, about $90 million, and then statutory reserves at $104 million. And those statutory reserves, they're governed by a bylaw, so there is restrictions on how the city can use those funds. And I think it's really important for the public to understand that investment in tangible capital assets is not a funding source for the city. That's infrastructure we own. So the only way that we could actually use it is we went and sold the assets. So we're not going to sell our sewer mains. We're not going to sell our water mains. We're not going to sell our roads, those sorts of things. So it's the reserve funding that we can use to invest in additional infrastructure or spend on services. And it's also important, we did our 20-year investment plan and asset management plan update last spring, and it estimated that our asset replacement value in 2021 dollars was $4.8 billion. So as much as $1 billion in accumulated surplus sounds like a lot, we have $4.8 billion to replace our current infrastructure.
So Nanaimo has $800 million worth of stuff, buildings, infrastructure. If we had to replace it, it would be about $4 billion to replace it. And then maybe let's focus on, we have funds in various reserves. Where does that money, until it needs to be spent, where does it go? How do we invest it?
So the city invests in very secure investments. We do a lot of GICs. We have high interest savings accounts. We do have an investment policy at the city here that governs how we invest our money, and we do invest it very securely because we want to make sure it's there for the future and it earns a return and that it's not going the other way.
Is it possible for the members of the public to see like a detailed breakdown of what investments the city of Nanaimo has?
No, we don't publish anywhere a breakdown of how the funds are invested.
And maybe going back to the 2023 year, so year over year, the city's revenue was $52 million more in 2023 than 2022. Around $11 million of that increase was from an increase in tax revenue, most of which the property tax increase. $16 million of our more money than the year before came from a one-time provincial grant through a growing communities initiative. So those two things are accounting for a bit more than half of the more money we took in 23 than 22. Where else did we make up money from the year before?
Correct. So those were the two biggest items that increased over 2022. We also, in 2023, we received $3.3 million in Investing in Canada Infrastructure Program grant. This funding was used at the new turf fields at Harewood Centennial Park. So that was one-time funding. We had interest income was up $5.9 million over 2022. So in 2023, we did see interest rates were still rising in the market. As well, in 2023, we did have some of our lower yielding investments mature, and we were able to reinvest those funds in higher earning investments. And then we also had an increase of $6.9 million in development cost charge revenue. So DCC's, development cost charge revenue, we recognize that when the funds are spent, not when the funds are collected from developers. So in 2023, we had a number of growth projects going on in the city that were funded from development cost charges. So we were able to recognize that revenue to help pay for those projects.
And then on the other side of the ledger, our expenses increased by $18 million from the previous year. The two biggest items responsible for that are increases in wages and increases in contracted services. Could you maybe tell me a little bit more about the second of those two things?
Sure. So we had a $2.4 million increase in the RCMP contract over 2022. Touching on wages and benefits were up $5.4 million. This included, we had 20 new firefighters that started in August. We had the first full year for our 12 new community safety officers and our 4-member clean team. As well, there was 12 other positions added across the city, plus one part-time position that all are helping with service delivery. And then the other thing that makes up part of that $18 million is we had a $2.5 million increase in our operating projects. And about $1.1 million was related to social planning projects, such as the Building Safer Communities project, as well as the second round of the Strengthening Communities program. And both of those programs were supported by grant funding.
And I know off the top you mentioned it gets complicated to explain the details of maybe what happens to a year-over-year surplus. But maybe on a simple level, if we take a look at each of the past 5 years, so 2019, 2020, 2022, we had a surplus each of those years around $40 million. Last year, $72 million. That's a much bigger number, $30 million more of surplus. Can you just give me a sense of, is this an exceptional year, and what happens to the surplus? Does it go into the reserve funds?
Well, you're focusing on the surplus that goes into our accumulated surplus. So that is made up of things, like I said, changes in our reserve balances, as well as our investment in tangible capital assets. I think more the question focuses back, as I was saying, to the operational surplus, which we allocate out each year and how that changes. So, for example, in 2023, our operational surplus for the general fund was $8.7 million. And we did go to council in March, and we gave council recommendations on how to allocate that funding out. So some of the funding went to our RCMP contract reserve, $1.7 million, which that reserve helps us in years where our contract might exceed budget estimates. We've also used funding from that reserve to help address some of the space need challenges at the detachment. We put $1.2 million into our general financial stability reserve to ensure it meets its minimum balance. So we do have a general financial stability reserve at the city, and this maintains anywhere, best practice is 45 to 90 days of our annual operating expenditures. So this helps us if, say, a major taxpayer for the city didn't come through and pay, because we can't operate at a deficit. Or say we had some sort of natural event in the city and we needed money to fund some repairs or that sort of thing. It's our rainy day fund there. So we keep that. We have a reserve policy at the city, and we do have requirements on how much we want to keep in that reserve. We also allocated $2.87 million to our special initiatives reserve. $1.5 million is earmarked for land for the South End Community Center. We also put $500,000 of that money away to address support services for the unhoused population in 2024. So just a few of the examples. Each year, we do generally have an operating surplus in all three of our funds, because as I said, we can't operate at a deficit. So having a bit of a surplus is a good thing. We don't want to be in the deficit position, but though that funding is generally allocated to reserves that'll fund future services or infrastructure for the city.
Midcoast Morning will be right back.
Midcoast Morning is made possible by the Community Radio Fund of Canada's Radio Meters program and listeners like you. Support Midcoast Morning and CHLY's nonprofit newsroom today by becoming a sustaining donor at chly.ca/donate. Local news can't survive without your support. Another way to help us out is to share this show with your friends and tell them why they should support us. Finally, if you're listening to the podcast edition of Midcoast Morning, go and give us a positive review on Apple Podcasts or whatever podcast feed you use. It helps people find us.
We're looking at Nanaimo's finances on today's episode. This week, City Council adopted the 2023 Annual Municipal Report, which contains a detailed breakdown of the year's revenue and expenses. I'm speaking with Wendy Fulla, Director of Finance for the City of Nanaimo. You talked a few times about we can't run at a deficit. It's just not allowed. Could you give me a primer of how debt works at the municipal government level?
Sure. So the city, like most BC municipalities, we borrow through the Municipal Finance Authority of BC, and there's legislation that governs how much the city can borrow. So there is a limit to how much we're allowed to borrow. Based on our 2023 financial statements, our annual debt servicing limit would be $61.8 million, and currently the city sits at about 12.3% of our limit. Now, we do have a debt policy here at the city, and that helps ensure that the debt financing is used strategically to maintain the city's financial strength and stability. The city is allowed to borrow up to the point where our debt servicing, so our principal and interest payments, would be $61.8 million. Yeah, we'd have to, depending on what the interest rate is and that sort of thing, that would govern what that amount is. At the end of December, we were at 12.3% of our limit. So the city does have capacity to take on more debt. The city currently doesn't carry a lot of debt, so we definitely have capacity there to take on additional debt.
What are the considerations around borrowing money, taking on debt as a municipal government?
I think one of the things that we need to look at when we borrow is intergenerational equity. So you want to borrow for projects where future taxpayers are going to benefit from the service, because it makes sense then that they pay their fair share of the cost.
And when we take into account the fact that, unlike, say, a provincial or a federal government, the city is operating at a surplus, how does maybe the rate of interest we would be charged if we were to borrow money for a project compared to maybe the rate of interest our reserve funds accumulate? Like, is it reasonable or fair? How can people conceptualize like how the city operates its finances on that sort of when do I need to pay off my debt versus when do I need to make investments if I have the capacity to do both? When is it fair to make comparisons between, say, how an individual might act and the city?
Yeah, so when the city borrows money, because we borrow through the MFA, it does work differently. We do get at the end of the day, it costs us less than, say, if we went to a chartered bank, because there's a sinking fund, and that could get really complicated technical terms, but it is different when we borrow from an MFA. Then we also have our investment funds where we do target a certain rate of return. But with our investments, as I said, we also have to watch with our statutory reserve funds. They do have bylaws that govern how we can spend them. So even though we might have a lot of money sitting in one reserve, it might not be a funding source that we can actually use for a project. We also want to make sure that we maintain minimum reserve balances so that we're able to respond to issues that may come up. For example, a couple of years ago, the boiler at the Nanaimo Aquatic Center failed, and quite quickly we were able to arrange to purchase a replacement because we do have reserve funds available. We do keep money there so that we can respond to things like that come up so we can continue service levels.
A major potential borrowing project has been sort of in the course of being in the works over the last year for the Nanaimo Operations Center to fund upgrades to the public works yard. The city is seeking permission has been seeking permission from the voters to borrow up to almost $50 million. Can you tell me about what sort of the financial implications of that are, the considerations in making that ask of the electorate on the city's end?
When we're looking at major capital projects like that, we always look at all the different funding sources available. This is a great example of where that intergenerational equity applies. A new public works facility, so the new Nanaimo Operations Center, it will provide services for years to come, which means that future residents of the city, future businesses of the city are all going to benefit from the services provided out of that center. So it makes sense to use debt funding there in this case so that everybody pays their fair share.
And on maybe a more general level, with the property taxes collected by the city, with the explosion maybe in the value of real estate in Canada over the last 5 years, how does that affect the property taxes people pay in Nanaimo?
So what really matters when you get your assessment from BC Assessment is how your home changed compared to the market. So if your home moves in the same up or down as the rest of the market did, then when the city has a, say, 7.7% property tax increase, your property taxes will go up approximately 7.7%. However, if your home value went up more than the market, then you will see your property taxes increase more. And it's just based on that your property is now worth more than the average change in the market. And consequently, if your house goes down in value or doesn't go up as much as the average for the market, then your property taxes won't be whatever the property tax increase is for the city. And of course, we're talking about residential, not business or commercial, which is much more complicated.
Moving to maybe that more complicated aspect. First of all, one thing I found interesting reading the report that has a granular level of detail is that for commercial enterprises that pay property taxes over $250,000 a year, you can just go and look and see what kind of property tax, say, the owner of the country club center pays. How does it work? How are those figures calculated for commercial enterprises?
Similar to residential taxes, all commercial properties, they have an assessed value. We know what the assessment is for that property class. And then we have a certain amount of property taxes that are allocated to that class that we need to collect from. And then we calculate a mill rate to figure out their property taxes.
So one thing that has been in the works was adopted at this week's council meeting was two measures, a downtown revitalization tax exemption program, and then a similar program for hotel development, a tax exemption program. What do people need to know about how exactly that works?
So a hotel tax exemption program has no impact to the overall revenue for the city. So we will still collect the same amount of property taxes from that class of properties. What it does mean is that we don't collect taxes on the value of that improvement during the time period of the exemption. So that cost of that burden is spread amongst the remaining properties in that class.
So basically, if there is a new hotel that's built and takes advantage of this exemption, they won't be paying property taxes on the improved value. And it's not that the city is getting less revenue. It's that every other commercial property will just have to pay slightly more.
Correct. It'd be the other properties within that class would be absorbing that exemption. Correct. Because we will still collect the same amount of taxes that is required from that class of properties. It's just they won't be contributing for the assessed value that is exempt during the portion of the exemption.
We're halfway into 2024. Can you tell me a little bit about where our finances are right now for the year, where they project to be? Does it look similar to how it was in the past year?
We have not done our first quarterly reporting for the year. We don't usually do projections for Q1. Usually Q2 is our first projection. So we haven't done those yet at this time.
Were there any curveballs maybe that came in 2023 with respect to our finances, things we weren't expecting that we had to accommodate?
I don't think there was any really curveballs in 2023. I think we were pleasantly surprised for us that our interest income was up. Unfortunately, the downside of that is it is not as good for residents of the city because interest rates being up means their mortgage payments and that sort of things are up. But that definitely did help the city on our revenue side. Inflation continues to be an issue just as it is for the general public. It is an issue for the city, inflation, that we are seeing cost increases, and it is starting to stabilize a bit, but it is tough. We're subject to the same inflation that the public is and those cost increases. We still see some supply chain challenges and, of course, hiring challenges. I think the city faces a lot of the same things other businesses face in the city.
And this situation of we have a surplus, we have net assets in the tens or hundreds of millions of dollars. This is a common situation across municipalities in BC, correct? Nanaimo is not unique in this?
We're not unique. And I do want to reiterate, we don't budget for a surplus. We always present a balanced budget every year. As I said, you can't look at the financial statements and look at the surplus number there. That is more than just, we made money. That is investment in net tangible capital assets. I said it's better to go back and look at that operational surplus that we take to council each March. That is kind of where we brought in more revenue or spent less money than we thought we were going to. And then we have an operational surplus there. And as I said, it's always good to have a bit of an operational surplus because we can't operate at a deficit. So we are always conservative with our revenue figures to ensure that we are not caught short. So when you consider the city's overall budget, our surplus really isn't that large. You know, we do have this year in 2024, we have almost $172 million project budget, and we have close to a $200 million operating budget. So the city is a fair size. And when you look in the general fund last year in an $8.7 million operating surplus, percentage-wise, it's not that large in comparison to the city's budget. And I know for people sitting at home and you're listening and you're going, wow, $8.7 million, that's like winning the lottery. But on a city this size and the cost to operate a city this size, it's a very small percentage.
Is there anything else you think maybe it's important to bring to a conversation like this? Any part of maybe city finances that you feel in conversations you might overhear in the public aren't especially well understood that you'd like the chance to maybe address?
I think probably the biggest thing is really the surplus issue and the accumulated surplus, because I think people see the accumulated surplus and they assume the city has a lot of money sitting there. But as you and I talked about, a lot of it is invested in assets. The city owns a lot of assets. We own roads and buildings and sewer pipes and water mains, water treatment plant. We own dams. We own land. The city owns a lot of infrastructure, and that makes up a lot of that accumulated surplus. So it's not that we have money just sitting there available to spend. It's invested in assets.
And again, the breakdown on those numbers is about 800 million is what you're talking about, their assets. And then we have just under 200 million in kind of financial assets that we've accumulated.
Correct.
Would there still be maybe anything you'd want to say to a sentiment of, well, $200 million is no sum to sneeze at, and every year it feels like council is agreeing to a property tax increase of 7.5% and kind of begrudgingly, but we're in the black. What would your kind of response to that sentiment be?
I think one thing to consider is we do 10-year project planning here at the city. So when you look and you say, oh, we have $194 million in reserves, we also have millions and millions of dollars worth of projects planned over the next 10 years. And a lot of that reserve funding will be used to fund those projects. We are a growing city. It takes infrastructure to grow the city. We're a great city to live in. And that means we have a Bevan Park, we have a Nanaimo Aquatic Center, we have cultural facilities, we have all of those things that make Nanaimo a place you want to live in, and that all takes money. It takes reinvestment. As I said, when you look at the replacement value of our assets at $4.8 billion, the $194 million in reserves doesn't even make a dent in replacing $4.8 billion worth of assets. So I think people always have to not just focus on one number, but look at the big plan. Look at our 20-year investment plan. We do a 10-year capital plan every year. We also update our 20-year investment plan every 3 to 5 years. And we do have an infrastructure funding gap. It's close to $1 billion when we did our last update. That's why we have the 1% annual increase for the general asset management reserve. So I think people have to look at big picture and not just focus on one number or one project. We're always looking ahead. We're looking to the future. We want to make sure that we do have money for those future projects coming down the line.
Wendy Fulla, thank you so much for taking the time to speak with me.
Thank you for your time.
Wendy Fulla is the Director of Finance for the City of Nanaimo. You can find the 2023 Annual Municipal Report we were discussing on the city's website. That's our show for the day. Thank you for joining me. I'm Joe Pugh, host and producer of Midcoast Morning. Jesse Woodward is our executive producer, and Arby Frew is our technical advisor. You can sign up for CHLY's newsletter at chly.ca/subscribe for updates from our nonprofit newsroom. Our theme song is First One by local Nanaimo band Waste Management. If you have a story you'd like us to cover, email us at news@chly.ca. That's all for now. I'll talk to you on another Midcoast Morning.
Midcoast Morning would not be possible without the funding of the Community Radio Fund of Canada's Radio Meters program and listeners like you. Midcoast Morning is a project of CHLY's nonprofit newsroom. Support nonprofit journalism in Nanaimo and on the Sailor Sea today by becoming a monthly sustaining donor at $5 or more per month. Support the program at chly.ca/donate. If you're already a supporter, record a voice memo telling others where you're listening from and why they too should support our work. After you're done, you can email it to us. Also, share the podcast with your friends. While Meta is blocking Canadian users from sharing news content on their Facebook feeds, you can still share our podcast directly with your friends via Facebook or Instagram Messenger. Finally, this program acknowledges and gives thanks to the Nanaimo First Nation as we broadcast and podcast from their traditional territory. Thanks for listening.